The information and opinions presented in this Arc Energy Ideas podcast are provided for informational purposes only and are subject to the disclaimer link in the show notes.
This is the Arc Energy Ideas podcast with Peter Tertzakian and Jackie Forrest, exploring trends that influence the energy business.
Welcome to the Arc Energy Ideas podcast. I'm Jackie Forrest.
And I'm Peter Tertzakian. Welcome back. And, well, if you have enjoyed the long weekend, it's welcome back after the long weekend. We're recording on the Tuesday.
We are, and great warm weather in Calgary, but lots of smoke, reminding us of all the wildfires that are happening in northern Alberta.
Yeah.
Not a great situation. Hopefully getting better with some rain yesterday.
Last week was not great at all for the smoke. Saturday was not particularly good. It started to clear yesterday, and we got some rain up there. So we're thinking of the people up there. I mean, it's just a terrible situation.
Just hope that these fires get under control and we get some rain. I mean, that's the real issue up north is it's so dry.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the election, which is coming up.
Yeah, and so we're going to have a couple of topics today, but we're going to have a guest join us, and we're really excited to introduce our special guest, John Dillon. John has spent over 32 years at the forefront of climate change policy in Canada, and he recently retired from his role as Senior Vice President of the Business Council of Canada. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Great, yeah, thanks, John. And just for the benefit of our audience, where are you coming from? Where are you talking from?
I'm in beautiful downtown Ottawa.
Fantastic. Okay.
All right. Well, hey, we'll get the Ottawa perspective on the Alberta election here. So, and now that you're retired, John, you can just say what you feel. So don't hold back.
That's right. Yeah, you have no career-limiting moves. Okay, so Alberta election. The election is, I don't know, I've been away for 3 weeks. It's
6 days.
It's in 6 days?
Yeah, next Monday.
Next Monday.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know that the early polls are open and starting today. You can go out and start voting advance. But the big day is next Monday, and so we are also going to record, once we know the results, our podcast on Tuesday. We usually release the podcasts on Tuesday, but as with this week and next week, we're going to release them on a Wednesday, right?
That's right, because we want to, well, first we had the May long weekend, and both of us didn't want to come in on Monday. But next week, we thought it would just make more sense to wait one day and be able to give some views on what happened.
Right. So this is a two-party race, I think it's safe to say. It's the NDP and the UCP. And we have Rachel Notley from the NDP leader, and she is going up against Danielle Smith. Both of these two leaders are veterans of elections past. Both are well known to the public, and it's very interesting. I think as an overarching statement on the election and energy is not as prevalent a topic in the election narratives for either the UCP or the NDP this time, right? I mean, it's the social circumstance with high inflation, COVID policy, legacy stuff, healthcare, et cetera. These are the big hot button topics. Energy-focused issues, nor I would argue even climate change, which used to often be at the top of the priority list of what people were thinking about. Now it's all about healthcare. We see that in the narratives of the NDP. And it's all about leadership and so on and so forth, and inflation and affordability and stuff like that.
John, maybe you could add some comments from the Ottawa lens there.
Yeah, I think that's generally true, Peter, although obviously every time there's an extreme weather event, including the forest fires right now, there's a fair amount of attention paid to climate change. But I think you're right. The issues of inflation and economic uncertainty are a bigger issue across the country right now than climate change. And climate has always been something that kind of moves up and down, and it's always a basic concern of Canadians, but the prevalence tends to waver up and down over time.
It's interesting you point that out. I mean, the fires really started when the election kicked off. I mean, the first forest fires was probably 3 weeks ago. The smoke didn't really engulf the province in Western Canada until, I don't know, arguably a week ago, depending on where you were, maybe 2 weeks ago if you were further up north. But it didn't really trigger any change in the platforms of any of these parties, and it didn't start talking climate change because of the forest fires, would you say, John? Right.
No, and of course, a lot of the policy is in place, although it's still debated to some degree, and we know the debate that's been ongoing about the carbon tax. But both provinces and the federal government are putting a lot of policy in place. There's still some that are controversial, including the plan for clean electricity grid by 2035 and the cap on oil and gas emissions, which are obviously federal policies, which are going to have real implications for Alberta.
Well, Danielle Smith has certainly said even before the election was called, I mean, she did have a stance with respect to things like emissions cap and sort of very protective of our oil and gas industry. Basically, the narrative is, I'm going to stand up and fight for you against Ottawa and so on. So we're going to talk more about that. We're going to talk more about sort of the policies and how each party, if elected, will handle Ottawa, because I think that's a big thing. But I would say that the UCP has been much more vocal about that issue than the NDP. The NDP is really focusing more on the issue of leadership, trust, healthcare, affordability.
Yeah. Now, Danielle Smith is against the cap, and we'll get into that in this next section. The NDP have come out. Rachel Notley says she does not oppose the cap in principle, but the current plan is too onerous.
Right.
So she has sort of pushed back on Ottawa, which a lot of, the narrative from the UCP is that she's just working with Justin Trudeau. So she's trying to show, hey, I don't agree with that particular policy. It's going to hurt the province. Well, let's take advantage of the fact that we can do a look back. It's kind of interesting that we have two candidates here, one that was a premier for 4 years, one that was leader of the opposition. And of course, the UCP has had 4 years here in Alberta. So what can we learn from the past track record? So I thought it would be fun to go through some of the big policies that each group put forward. And the NDP, there actually was a lot on energy. It was a different time, like you say, where energy was really a very top priority for the government. But we had things like the royalty review, Peter, which I know you were part of. Other big policies were the early shutdown of coal, putting a limit on oil sands emissions. Remember all the CEOs and the environmental groups on the stage? There was also the Liberals bought the TMX, and
the federal Liberals.
The federal Liberals bought the TMX, and the NDP government. In fact, at the debate last week, Notley made the point several times that she got the new pipeline to Tidewater. I think she did have a big influence in terms of, I think that cap helped. I think the working with BC, remember they had their demands. Maybe, John, we'll bring you in here. Do you think that Rachel Notley deserves credit for getting the TMX to Tidewater and the Liberals acquiring the project?
I think she does deserve some of the credit. I mean, obviously, it was a challenging time in terms of negotiating with an NDP party in British Columbia that was fairly sizably opposed to it and supported by the Green Party and their coalition government. And I think she helped change the public opinion of it, both in Alberta and across the country, because NDP governments, at least outside of, for most Canadians, are not known for being big supporters of oil and gas. So she took a very realistic and common sense approach to it, and I think helped build public support for it. At the end of the day, though, as Peter said, the Liberal government had to buy the pipeline because the owners at the time really felt that there was just too much risk involved in it. And of course, it's turned out to be a very expensive project. But at the end of the day, it's going to serve the industry in terms of its ability to export oil in particular, which we've never had before. The other thing I would say is that, of course, she was working at the time with a lot of Liberal provincial governments across the country. You mentioned standing on stage with all those other players. The current federal environment minister, Stephen Guilbeault, likes to point out that he was on that stage as well. But it had support from not just the industry, but also environmental groups, and support across the country in terms of a number of Liberal governments in other provinces, many of which have changed since that time. But it was one of the reasons why the federal government was able to secure some form of agreement on carbon pricing as well.
Yeah, right. You're right. That was a big part of the climate agreement on the federal level.
Can I just say about this TMX thing? Because I look at it and say, well, why? How is it that we got to the point where the federal government had to buy it out? Because to me, if you look at the history of the TMX and the TMS expansion, the industry was willing to pay for it. It was just that it was so bogged down in regulatory issues and all sorts of other issues of the day that ultimately the principal proponent and the financiers dominantly from the U.S. basically said, we're out of here. And so the pieces had to be picked up by the federal government. And yes, it's true, Rachel Notley was part of that and the prevailing governments at the time. But I think what's important in this election is to think about that experience and think about which party is going to deal with what I would call the national energy policy dysfunction that we have and which leader is going to handle the forward energy policy issues with Ottawa better. And there's really two camps. There's one which is sort of the more, well, let's take a much more combative stance. And there's one, the other stance would be, well, let's collaborate more. And it's unresolved. And there's arguments to doing both by the proponents. I'm not going to pass judgment. I'm just going to say people have a decision to make in terms of how they want to see energy policy go forward. John, what do you get that sense too, that there's sort of a couple of options here, one of butting heads versus sitting around a table?
I do, and we see that, I think, on other issues besides climate change as well, which I think is unfortunate. I think at the end of the day, this has to be resolved collaboratively. We've already had one case go to court on the carbon tax. There's another case before the Supreme Court now on the constitutional validity of the federal government's environmental assessment regime, and we'll see how all that plays out. But at the end of the day, policies have to be made in a collaborative spirit. And I think what industry is looking for is the certainty and predictability of policy, which you don't get when there's the threat of litigation, including from First Nations, obviously, over some issues. But generally speaking, business likes policy predictability. They don't like to see skirmishes on a regular basis.
We'll just quickly finish off the other major policies were the curtailment of oil production. So Rachel Notley may have helped get the TMX on, but she faced the problems of the lack of our takeaway capacity with those big blowouts. It was very controversial, and it resulted in them procuring a bunch of rail, which was deemed maybe to be a lot of money that wasn't needed, because when COVID came along, we didn't necessarily need that rail capacity in the end. But I would say that the NDP, did have more collaboration with the feds, and there's some advantages to that for sure. And I also think they did hold a number of collaborative processes like the royalty review in terms of bringing people together.
Well, I would argue they were combative as well. I mean, they put into place the policy that gave them the option to dial down the throughput through TMX to BC.
That's right, yeah.
In conjunction with the ban on wine imports from BC.
That's right.
Both of these leaders, I think, can be tough if need to be. And there's some sense that only Danielle Smith can be tough with Ottawa or other provinces. But I think Rachel Notley also has a record of being tough. And by the way, that policy is still out there. That legislation was passed, that Alberta can dial down oil throughput to BC if needed.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the UCP now. Of course, Jason Kenney was the premier for a lot of this, and there were a lot of other issues this government had to deal with COVID, health crisis for a couple of years, and now inflation. But I'll just bring up some high-level ones. Invested in the Keystone XL, so while Rachel Notley had her crude by rail, they had their Keystone XL, which turned out to be not a good use of money because, of course, the project got canceled by Biden. They did make a number of changes to TIER. They did start the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. We had that podcast with Enbridge that talked about how that was critical for the deal that they made to sell a part of their pipeline to
What is that? That's $1 billion, isn't it?
The $1 billion fund, right? But
yeah.
So, in fact, Rachel Notley said in the debate that she agreed with this policy and would even expand it. That's one policy she was supportive of that the UCP brought in. As John mentioned, they challenged the feds on carbon price. They're challenging them on our environmental impact assessment right now, or formerly known as Bill C-69. Very controversial.
Oh my God, don't bring that up again.
They were frustrated with the oil and gas industry for not spending more money on CapEx. They had cut the corporate tax rate. This is still a discussion right now because Rachel Notley wants to increase it again, but they'd cut it from 12% to 8%. And they hoped that extra money would flow into people spending more money on oil and gas. But as you know, investors were demanding the money back.
I'm just going to chime in here because it's not like government can do much about that. The issue of whether or not the oil and gas industry is going to spend more money on CapEx, drilling, et cetera, development really is a function of the financial markets. And we've talked about that on this podcast before, is that there's two kinds of policy or regulatory influences on the oil and gas industry. One comes from government, and that's one that's very overt and everybody hears about in the newspapers and so on. But the other major influence is how the capital markets and the financial industry influences whether or not they invest in oil and gas companies, and whether ultimately the boards of directors and the other financiers that are part of the decision-making make a conscious decision to invest. Now, we know since 2018, there's been almost zero investment going into these companies from Bay Street, Wall Street, et cetera. So whether or not the tax rate goes up and down, I would argue is not really the governing variable of whether or not the oil and gas industry invests money into the ground.
As we saw in real time.
John, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I think you're right, Peter. And to that, I would just add the issue of what the long-term demand forecast looks like. One of the reasons they're feeling pressure from the financial community is this question of, how much more can oil demand grow, and when will it peak, and when will it start to decline? And there's huge pressure on not just from the financial community, but from shareholders and stakeholders about, what's your long-term plan? And so a lot of that investment, as you know, is more focused on emissions reductions, things like CCUS, than it is on expanding production.
Right. Well, and they have not supported CCS financially. The feds have offered things like the tax incentives. Now they're talking about a contract for differences potentially through this, federal funds. But I think there has been some pressure for Alberta government to support that. We haven't seen that yet. And I just want to say one last thing. Remember the Energy War Room that was turned into the Canadian Energy Centre? That still exists, and that was definitely a big part of their platform. What
war are they fighting?
Well, I just went on their site, and there's several articles written in the last week that are talking about our oil and gas industry. So quickly, any takeaways from either of you on the UCP time? I will also mention they have put out a number of high-level strategies around the new economy, like a hydrogen roadmap, natural gas vision, mineral strategy, geothermal. Not a ton of money towards those things, but there's definitely been some work about where we need to go.
Yeah. Well, I think, though, the narratives are not front and center in terms of their campaigning and the platforms. Energy is still a big deal. And behind the scenes, I know that both are thinking a lot about the questions and the issues that we just raised. I believe both can be combative, but also both can be collaborative. And it's just a matter of style. What you hear in the headlines and what's going on is not necessarily what's going on behind the scenes. And I know, John, as an Ottawa veteran, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of issues that I think are going to be fairly important and that don't seem to be playing out very much in the election. But in talking about the UCP government, obviously they fought against the consumer-facing portion of the carbon tax, but they've largely adopted what the NDP had in terms of emissions pricing on industrial emissions, the so-called tier program. I think they may have made some modifications to it, but it's largely still intact. And that's something that the industry supports. I think the bigger issue or a big issue that isn't getting a lot of attention either is what's the future of natural gas, particularly in electricity. We've seen the coal phase out, and that's been very significant in Alberta. And obviously there's great wind and solar potential. Yeah. Natural gas is still going to be the backbone of the system, I think, for several more years. And how is that going to work with the federal policy of a zero emissions electricity grid by 2035?
Well, let's talk about some of those future policies. So you're kind of hitting on some of the go forward policies. Of course, the UCP were kind of silent on the net zero, but they came out last month with the document that says they have an aspirational goal for carbon neutrality by 2050. So the NDP and UCP both have the view of net zero by 2050. But this net zero electricity by 2035, there's definitely a difference in the perspective. The UCP are not committed to net zero by 2035. They want a plan that provides reliable and affordable electricity. Meanwhile, the NDP are committed. Now, the UCP claim that, by going the way the NDP want, it would cost $80 billion plus to Albertans. The NDP say that's kind of overblown in terms of that estimate, but it will cost something. So there's a difference there. And when it comes to natural gas, the UCP has said they're pro-natural gas for power, pro-LNG. Natural gas should be a transition fuel for decades to come. And we actually haven't heard anything on the NDP that I've been able to find about their view on natural gas.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the two variables are time, can it be done by 2035, and what is the cost? And who's going to pay for that cost as a corollary? I think both are contentious. Both are starting to amp up, both overtly and behind the scenes. And hey, in the prairie provinces, it gets cold. And so we need natural gas. The thing is that the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine in the winter. On very cold days, the wind doesn't blow. So, what are we going to do?
And we don't have big hydro within Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Yeah, and this is going to be a big challenge across the country because there are many other places that are still reliant on natural gas for both heat and electricity. We've seen the UCP government in Alberta, but also the Ford government in Ontario, roll back or provide rebates on electricity whenever the cost gets a little too high. Because it's a consumer issue, but it's also a business competitiveness issue. I mean, one of the advantages that Canada's had is a relatively clean electricity grid and a relatively affordable one. The next changes and the next big portfolios to get to that zero emissions grid are going to be very expensive. And Peter's absolutely right. Who's going to pay for that? And how are we going to maintain both public acceptance of that and also a competitive position of Canadian industry?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the timing, during the debate, I felt like Danielle Smith seemed to say that they'd get there by 2050. I think that's the time she's thinking for electricity. So big difference there in terms of the timeframes. Let's talk quickly. We talked about the cap already. The UCP is against the cap. It will hurt Alberta. It will cause us to cut our production, and it will result in carbon leakage. Meanwhile, the NDP does not oppose a cap in principle, but the current plan is too onerous. So I think they're aligned somewhat in that.
I mean, both parties see that the cap is potentially damaging to the economy, the functioning of the biggest industry. I mean, even Scott Moe in neighboring Saskatchewan has identified the same issue and is becoming much more vocal about it.
Yeah. I think the question here is what kind of reduction over what period of time?
That's it.
You've seen some of what the oil sands industry is saying, and I think the oil sands is the biggest. Peter, you probably know the numbers, but is clearly the biggest contributor out of oil and gas emissions in Canada. And they have said they're not against a cap, but they want one that's realistic and one that they can actually do in the time frame that's allowed to them. And it relies on a lot of investments in technology, and policy clarity is not there yet to allow some of those investments to happen.
The policy is definitely the proposals are murky. It's like trying to apply a blanket policy on a huge industry that is not a homogeneous thing. I always say it's like applying policy to retail shopping. Well, what does that mean? Are you talking about shopping malls? Are you talking about corner stores? Are you talking about online shopping? Like one policy for oil and gas emissions cannot fit all modalities of extraction. It cannot fit oil sands, which is highly concentrated and has a very unique extraction modality relative to conventional, which spans a huge landscape, not only geographic, but political, because of the different provinces, all the way from northeast BC, all the way to southeast Saskatchewan, big swath through the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin through Alberta. It's just very complicated in terms of how to, and the clarity is just not there. And to bring clarity to it is going to be something that is going to have to be dealt with on day one after the election, because the federal government is still very determined to get some kind of policy. So we'll see how that's dealt with.
Okay, well, I think we've covered off the big topics for the election. Maybe we'll switch gears now to talk about John's, John, you've been in career thinking about climate policy for a long time, and you've been with the Business Council of Canada, I think since the early 1990s, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. We thought we'd just get some of your reflections in terms of how climate policy has evolved in this country over your career to finish off the podcast.
Sure.
So maybe we'll start with, you were involved with Rio and Kyoto climate meetings. So those were what years were those events?
Rio was 1992, and that's when the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. Kyoto was 1997.
Okay, so when you think about those UN meetings and so many that have been held since then, and then you look at what happens to emissions, they continue to go up each year. What do you think about these meetings? Should they continue? Are they an effective way of solving this problem?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be one to claim that the United Nations has made great progress on this. It has its limitations on so many global issues. But I think the meetings have been effective in terms of bringing all players to the table. If you remember the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first legally binding commitment under the Climate Change Convention, only covered developed countries, and what were defined as developed countries in those days didn't include China, India, Brazil, South Africa, a lot of the Middle East, etc. So we needed a mechanism to continue to engage those other countries that are big emitters. The beauty of the Paris Agreement, which came much later in 2015, was that it allowed countries to sort of come in on their own terms, including China and India and other major developing countries, because this idea that somehow you could impose targets on countries really wasn't going to work. So I think it's important that they remain at the table, but at the end of the day, it has to be a collective global effort. And we've seen too many examples of countries that don't want to play by the rules. So we have to figure out, and I don't have any magic solution as to how we do that.
Right.
But I think we have to keep the countries at the table and talking about this.
So that's the global view. Let's bring this back to Canada and the Business Council of Canada, with which you've been for, 30 years. How does the corporate Canada feel about climate policies, especially the last 5 to 10 years? And I'm thinking specifically, like, as the timelines get tighter, we're talking about net zero by 2050, but actually a lot of the targets are 2030, 2035, which are just looming. You have a lens into all the different industries in Canada. How are they viewing the realism of the targets that are being set out and the magnitude of the cuts that have to be realized on those dates?
Well, I think there's always been a problem, and this goes back to the very early days of this file, with setting ambitious targets and not focusing enough on how we're actually going to meet them and talking about the policy. Two things have happened in the business community. One, obviously, is the evidence of climate change is compelling now. It wasn't always in the early days. People didn't understand exactly what that meant, to have 3 to 5 degree change in average global temperatures over several decades. But now we're seeing real evidence of that. And we're seeing, obviously, huge movements in public views on this and in government action on it. So the business community, I think, as a whole, is fully engaged on this issue. And I'm seeing evidence, again, from where I sat at the Business Council, of that across sectors. Yes, in the early days, a lot of focus was on oil and gas and still is, but we're seeing changes happening across electricity and buildings and construction and concrete and steel and cement and a whole range of mining. Obviously, the auto sector is moving significantly towards electric vehicles and other low carbon sources, and huge movement around the minerals and other materials that will supply that growing EV industry.
Right. So can I just interject? Like, you use this word that the business community is much more engaged as the deadlines loom, as we see more evidence of climate change. So there's proverbial lights go on. But there's a difference between being engaged and then the realities of what you have to accomplish and the decisions you have to make at the boardroom table in terms of capital spending to transform your business into achieving these targets. Like, can you talk about that, sort of, I'll call it the table level decision-making, dialogues that are going on?
Yeah, well, it clearly is a focal point at most board tables these days. We talked earlier about how the financial community is looking at this and putting pressure on it. Companies and boards are feeling that pressure from their own employees, from shareholders, from stakeholders, from regulatory agencies. Frankly, everyone's asking. I know that ESG doesn't always win applause in all sectors of this country, but the fact is that most companies are living with that today. They're feeling the pressure to come up with plans, and at the end of the day, the board has to make those decisions about what investments make sense.
So let's talk about the magnitude of the investment, because a few years ago, the public was engaged with climate change because the surveys went out and asked the question, hey, are you worried about climate change? Yes, of course I am. And then the subsequent question was, well, how much are you willing to spend on it? And I can't remember the exact number. It was the equivalent of a Netflix subscription per year was all that people were willing to pay. So now, making a parallel to the boardroom tables, there's engagement, as you called it, and realization and awareness and pressure from ESG regulations, whether it's financial or government policy driven. But what is the willingness to spend?
Well, I think it's real. I mean, I think obviously, we've talked a little bit, and we may chat more about the policy certainty and the investment incentives that companies are looking for. But, we're seeing investments in things like CCUS. not as much as we need, obviously, to meet ambitious targets like the one we have for 2030. But we're seeing, investments in hydrogen and low carbon concrete. And as I mentioned, we've got huge government incentives around EV, both purchases and obviously in building facilities, battery facilities and assembly facilities and so on. So the investment is there. I do think there's even more investment capital out there from private sources. There's a lot of pension plans and private equity funds that are looking, and some are still sitting on the sidelines waiting for some of that policy clarity that we've talked about earlier. The RBC did a study that put a couple of years ago that put the cost of the net zero transition in Canada at $2 trillion. I don't think many people dispute that. The government has referenced that. The federal government has referenced that in its own budget statements. So that's the level of investment that we're talking about. And that's not just private sector, that's public and private.
So, John, when you talked a little bit about some of the uncertainty on the policies in Canada, and that's holding back investment. So what do you think Canada needs to do if they are going to achieve such a big goal of a 40% reduction by 2030? Like what policy changes are needed to achieve that?
Yeah, I'm a lot more optimistic about the net zero by 2050 than I am about a 40% reduction by 2030. And I say that only because, you've talked about a lot of these projects and to a lot of these people. We still need time to figure out the rules around some of these really big investments, whether it's carbon capture and storage, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's, really ramping up electricity, clean electricity production, whether it's building all those EVs for people to drive. That's going to take time. So I think what we need are a few things. Number one, the policy clarity that I talked about earlier. What is it, that federal and provincial governments are going to do together to make this happen? The regulatory piece is absolutely critical. Even the federal government itself acknowledges that it takes too long to build a new mine in Canada, and yet we want to have, a vast supply of new critical minerals to feed batteries. The reality is that we need to figure out what are the really big projects that are going to make a difference, both in terms of Canada's economy and in achieving our climate change goals. You may have seen that in the U.S., Joe Manchin is talking about a bill that would do just that and put a time limit on the approval for those kinds of projects. I mean, there may not be exact parallels to make that work in Canada, but the federal government says it's serious about improving the regulatory process, but we need to see real action on that. And the recent paper that we did at the Business Council lays out some of the criteria of how you would determine what are the big infrastructure and other energy and clean energy projects that we need to get on with, because we can't wait 5, 6, 7, 8 years for those projects to be approved. There's no way we can make our 2030 target if that happens.
Yeah, I think these are all great points. And I think, further to the election discussion that we were having, so the issue of clarity, and by the way, we discussed that on the last podcast as well, Jackie, about investors need to understand it. In other words, that's to be clear in terms of what the terms of the policy are. Otherwise, the default is to pass and just move on to a different investment. So clarity is key. Resilience is key. And this really ties into the provincial election and other elections, including the federal election, is that if investors don't see that the policy is going to be resilient through governmental change, in other words, new government comes in and shreds the policy, then I'm not going to allocate billions to something that I'm quite dependent upon to make a return in the near term. So, resilience is key. And I think, finally, John, you talked about that. We talked about it as we wrap up this podcast. Is just harmony. I mean, there has to be some sense of function, not a whole bunch of dysfunction. Otherwise, we can't attract investment even from within the country, let alone abroad. And so much of Canadian infrastructural investment historically has come from outside of the country. And if we don't have some sense of function instead of dysfunction, foreign investors aren't coming here.
You're absolutely right. And we're seeing the example of the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. and how much that's drawing investment. So we really need to get our act together in the short term, because there's huge opportunities here for Canada. But I worry that we're going to miss out both on the economic opportunity, but also on our climate change targets if we don't get this right.
Yeah, and moving our economy into the new world and the new future. So,
okay, well, that's a wrap until the actual election, which is next week.
Thank you, John, for all of your insights today.
My pleasure. Thank you both.
Thanks to our listeners. If you like this podcast, please rate us on the app that you listen to and tell someone else about us.
For more ideas and insights, visit arcenergyinstitute.com.